Namaste. Welcome to
Namaste.
Sustainable Narratives 2022, supported by Earth Charitable Foundation. This fireside conversation is titled Is Indian Civilization a Myth? Joining us today is Vamadeva Shastri, also known as David Frawley. Namaste, Vamadevji, and welcome to Sustainable Narratives 2022.
Namaste. I'm very happy to be with you and look forward to the entire event.
Dhanyawad. Namaste. Pandit Vamadeva Shastri is a Vedic educator or Acharya who teaches internationally to promote Vedic knowledge. He is noted for his ability to integrate Ayurveda, yoga, and Vedic astrology into a single system for raising consciousness. He is also author for more than 30 books published in around 20 languages. His recent book, Mantra Yoga and Primal Sound, is regarded as one of the best available texts on mantra and includes the practice of mantra meditation. Thank you, and thanks for joining us, Vamdevji. Uh, Next, I would like to encourage all our audience to engage in the discussion by submitting your questions to the speaker. Please use the Q&A tab in AMate on the right of your screen. Vichaar Manthan explores contemporary issues of our current times through Indic civilization lens. On the other hand, there are many who deny the existence of such a civilization. We explore more about this question in detail with our expert witness today. Vamdevji, initially we start with your opening remarks, is about for 4 minutes. In that time, if you could define in your terms, what do you mean by a civilization? And also go
Yes.
on to elaborate, is there an Indian civilization? And to you, Vamdevji.
Yes. Civilization, as a general term, refers to long standing connections of cultures and nations. And it's not a political concept. It may be a religious concept. It may involve politics to some degree. So you have terms like European civilization. You don't have a term so much as British civilization. You have in terms of Western civilization, Chinese civilization. And of course, the concept of European civilization is mainly a concept of a few centuries. Now, in the global context, you have many enduring cultures that could be called civilizations. You could say ancient Egyptian civilization, or of course, Chinese civilization, and so forth. But if we look at ancient history, we see that the identity of India as a great country and civilization goes back a very long time. When Alexander came to India about 2,300 years ago, one of his scribes named Megasthenes said he discovered in India a tradition of 153 kings going back 6,400 years. So obviously, the idea of a long historical continuity was there. And then a literature. The Vedic literature is the largest, oldest, and best preserved ancient literature in the world, extending to, I don't know, many thousands of pages, long before time of Buddha, even Krishna. So there's been a continuity of civilization in India relative to language, relative to philosophy, religion, spirituality, and a lot of the cultural issues, medicine, architecture, art, and so many things. So, in this context, India is obviously a very great civilization. But because today people are defining civilization according to the last 100, 200 years, and mainly in terms of science and technology, there's been a tendency to look down on India and see it through the lens of the colonial era. And that is what we need to question. Hariom.
Okay. So, but there is a lot of people who question the continuity of Indian civilization. And also, there are many people, they put this argument, especially scholars, they put forward this argument called Aryan invasion theory, which demonstrates that there is no Indian civilization at all. What would you say about that, Vamdevji?
Yes. Well, first of all, this Aryan theory is the theory of the colonial era that tended to see things in terms of invasions and conquest and in terms of race and ethnicity, like the white supremacy, European supremacy. And the Aryan theory was the basis of some Nazi theories and other ideas of white supremacy because they discovered there were language and cultural connections between a lot of the ancient European cultures, the Celtic, the Greek, the Roman, the Slavic, the Germanic. So they wanted to propose an original homeland and identity for them racially. Problem is, there's similar connections with Iran and India, in particular, where people are not white skinned. And the older Indo European languages and the older extensive literature and culture was from India. So the only way they could avoid becoming offshoots of India was to create an invasion that brought the so-called Indo-European languages and cultures to India, and therefore they could preserve their identity as the original, what they called Aryans. Aryan is a Sanskrit word which means noble
Mhm.
or refined. And it's used most commonly by the Buddhist. Buddhists call their religion Arya Dharma. Buddha is Arya Buddha. Buddhist Sanghas are Arya Sangha. Many names like that. Jains also used it. They call their tradition Arya Dharma. We find Arya about 36 times in the Rig Veda. And again, it refers to this idea of refinement and knowledge. So it has nothing to do with any type of racial correlation or coming from the outside. It is the basis of a culture and a culture of respect and wisdom and dharma.
Right. So you mentioned earlier the civilization is need to be with the language, culture, religion, and there are so many factors which is a continuity of a religion. When it comes to the Aryan invasion theory, is it purely based on the linguistics? Is that fair to say?
Well, it was originally based upon the idea that there was an actual invasion that could
Okay.
be traced geographically and ethnically and by skeletons, by genetics, but that never really worked. So
Right.
linguistics was the last factor that they have had left because the archaeological, genetic, historical data is not there. They've never
Okay.
found any traces of invading Aryans that could be identified different from the indigenous people. And then we must remember linguistics is highly speculative.
Sure.
And the oldest language linguistics was based upon was Sanskrit, without which it probably wouldn't exist.
Right. Right. Uh, So, is it fair to say like the whole Aryan invasion theory doesn't stand to any scrutiny, even in the linguistics side as well? Is it? Uh, but why so many people still argue on this Aryan invasion theory and the debunk and especially they say there is no civilization in India and is especially with Aryans and Dravidian differences within the culture.
Well, some of this was built into a long term historical narrative that
Yeah.
was also quite advantageous to the colonial administration. If Aryans were invaders, then it's no problem that the British were invaders later. So it had
Right.
a certain political support. There was also a lack of understanding of Indian history, Indian text, and a rejection of the views of many of the independence Indian leaders like Sri Aurobindo, who questioned this whole Aryan idea. And then I
Right.
remember talking to someone. I said, "Why haven't you changed it if there's so much doubts?" And one of the professors said to me, "Well, until we know what to put in its place, we're intending to leave it there."
Okay. Just going on to the civilization part, Vamdevji, is there any evidence which says like there is a continuation in the Indian civilization.
India has the most extensive literary continuity of any civilization.
Okay.
Vedas long before Buddha, and the Vedas are traced to the region of Kurukshetra and the
Mhm.
Saraswati River. And we know that that was the main center of civilization in India going back 5 or even 10,000 years. And that at a certain point, maybe 4 or 5 thousand years ago, the Saraswati River dried up. And then the
Right.
continuity of the literature through Vedas, Brahmanas, Upanishads, Mahabharata, Ramayana, then into the classical systems, Buddhism, the Janapadas. So it's all their kings. And there were periods of foreign rule. But
Yeah.
today, in India, the same Vedic mantras are chanted that were many thousands of years ago. What country can say that?
Sure. So are we primarily saying it's a Vedas and also uh, culture, or and because now when you look into it, India, one of the biggest argument comes into this is India is invaded with so many invaders from outside, right from Mughals to recent Britishers, and it is considered as one of the uh, one of the culture which is amalgamation of many different cultures from outside. How could we say like this is uh, continuity in the culture as an Indian? How would we say it is an Indian civilization when there is so much of amalgamation of other cultures?
Well, first, I'd say Europe has had more of that, more invasions and more amalgamations than India. And even today, Europe is very far from being united. And then historically, where do we get terms like Indochina, Indonesia, reference of Indica in Alexander's period, Hindustan throughout the Middle Ages? So a recognition of a country culture has been there historically, and the teachings have survived. And the basic ethnic identity of India has a fair amount of continuity as much as other countries, but more so the cultural continuity. You find temples in South India have the same chanting, the same architecture as temples in North India. You have the different types of dance, so many Vedic dharmic traditions that in India and also spread. The largest Hindu temple in the world and one of the largest is Angkor Wat in Cambodia. So it is certainly not just something that lost its way along the path of history.
And at this point in time, I'd just like to ask all our audience as well engage in the discussion by asking questions. We're already seeing some questions are coming in, but I would like ask our all audience to ask as many questions as possible to Vamdevji. We are going to address them towards the end of this discussion. Uh, Going back to the question, uh, Vamdevji, even though if it is amalgamation of so many uh, uh, different cultures and being given it as a syncretic culture, when we call about after all of these things, what do you mean by when we say like it's an Indian civilization? What is the essence of that Indianness in this whole thing?
Well, first of all, this was traditionally called Bharatiya Sanskriti.
Yeah.
India was called Bharat. There were 16 Janapadas or provinces of India known at time of Buddha and various before that. Culture of Dharma, the Dharmic traditions, Dharmic laws, Dharmic sutras. Dharma is not a belief system or a faith. It's a recognition of universal consciousness, interdependence of all life, respect for all living beings, and of course, principles like yamas and niyamas of yoga, ahimsa, satya, and so on, and also a continuity of art, music, dance, philosophy, psychology, medicine, the intellectual culture, scientific culture. That is also there. So India's had its distinct identity. For
Right.
example, the numerical system came from India, surgery came from India. There's an ongoing uh, culture, civilization, values that was distinctly Indian. And that
right,
is why we have terms like Indochina. And it influenced the world. Buddhism influenced China. Even Japan not only has Buddhism, they have some of the oldest Hindu gods there.
right,
Indonesia was predominantly Hindu, Cambodia was. So it was more than just a local civilization. It was a civilization that could spread and influence most of Asia and perhaps Europe and much of the world as well.
right, right. And there is some other argument comes into this picture, especially when it comes to art and music and some of the traditions. A lot of people says the Mughals had a lot of influence on it, and the basic construct of the music and some of the even the cultural practices has had quite a lot of influence from other invaders, and that has completely embedded into India. So this is like you can't call it as an Indianness. But how could we address some of these challenges, or how could we address some of these questions?
Many ways. For example, the Mughals came from Central Asia. If you go back
Mhm.
at Central Asia at that time, they didn't have those type of temples. They didn't have that type of music. Islam was opposed to music. A lot of the early teachers of even the Sufis were Hindus. Uh, and so the Indian culture, and then we also find the same instruments mentioned in Vedic text. The ragas are based upon ancient text, and a lot of the music is built around Sanskrit text and stotras like those of Adi Shankara. So
Mhm.
the continuity is there. Continuity of architecture is also there.
Right, right. And another argument on this one as well is Indian civilization is known to evolve over time, and especially the cultural adaptability with the various uh,
Mm.
uh, civilizations or various cultures. And how much can it evolve before it stops being Indian civilization?
Well, first of all civilizations evolve. European civilization has evolved and changed very much. It's still
Yeah.
changing today. Part of the idea of civilization is something that evolves and encompasses, but it also maintains a certain core identity or values.
Mhm.
And you can again see the same text of thousands of years, the type of mantras, practices, yoga, meditation. You can study a text like Yoga Sutras that's over 2,000 years old for the practice of yoga today, chanting mantras from Vedas and honoring great teachers, text of Advaita Vedanta. And the Vedic science of consciousness is now being honored in science as well. So the continuity is there, but of course, names and forms change with time. That is
Right.
necessary. Otherwise, life would not be possible.
That's true. That's true. And as it evolving over the time, and the whole civilization, we said like there are a lot of factors, especially from the language and the religion, the culturally, the continuities existed.
Mhm.
Uh, can we say like is there any core value system which is underlying for the civilization? Vamdevji? What are the core values and the principles which kind of bind it together?
Well, these are the core dharmic values you find in the dharmic traditions Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, well known as ahimsa or nonviolence, the satya or the truthfulness, and
Yeah,
of course, the yoga sadhana,
yeah,
introspection, meditation. What India is importing to the world, its
hmm,
yoga and meditation traditions are the oldest core of Indian civilization. They're not what is necessarily happening in India today or what has
yeah,
happened in India over simply the last few decades.
hmm,
So these core Indic values are there, Satyameva Jayati. They were built
right,
into the courts, the education. So that
right.
identity is there for sure.
And especially dharma, you mentioned, is one of the core underlying principle for Indic civilization. And we at Vichar Manthan, we try to deal every aspect or any contemporary issues from the Indian civilizational lens. Pretty much, we are talking about dharmic lens, and especially sustainability is one of the core fundamentals of all our discussions and the explorations. Uh, and so, especially, we see that dharma and the sustainability are pretty much like interchangeably we use those words. Can you give us some of the practices of Indian civilization,
Yes,
which practiced dharmic ideas,
yes.
which kind of sustain the civilization?
Well, I want to make another point. The Indian idea of civilization embraces the whole of life, the whole of
Hmm.
nature. It honors all
Hmm.
living beings. It recognizes worlds beyond the physical.
Sure.
And so it's not this kind of human enclosed idea of civilization, man against nature. It is
Yeah.
embracing all. And that is also part of its core values. The Hindu
Yeah.
tradition calls itself Sanatana Dharma, which means a
Yeah.
universal or eternal tradition of Dharma.
Yeah.
No living being wants to be harmed. You do not
Yeah.
want to be harmed. So, respecting
Yeah.
universal Dharma, you don't harm anybody. It's not a commandment, it's not
Yeah.
simply a law of justice.
Yeah.
And this
Yeah.
leads to practices that
Yeah.
include many different types of rituals, festivals,
Yeah.
internal practices of yoga, mantra,
Yeah.
meditation, study of and preservation of certain philosophical texts that deal with everything from logic to the highest self realization, preserving knowledge over all, both mundane and spiritual,
Yeah.
and integrating art and spirituality, not being opposed to the use of images, saying this is the everything in India is a yoga. Use art as a yoga, meditation, music, dance. So this yogic view of life is also part of the Dharmic traditions.
So, and also the environment, especially the consciousness about the environment, how we use the resources from the nature. Some of these things were like big on the Indian tradition. And there is another argument, especially Indian civilization side, Vamdevji, about some people argue India as a nation is only from 1947 onwards. Before that, it was like invasions and the various small princely states, whatever the different of that, and uh, especially if we take for that argument, if India is considered as only from 1947 and we call it as an Indian civilization because they're calling India as in a before, is it fair to say the Indian civilization as a Hindu civilization as well, or especially in the Hindu, there are different ways of looking at that, right? Some people see it as in a religious way, some people look it as in a
Right.
cultural way, and the whole word of Indian civilization is comes into as a bit of argument because India as a nation only from the 1947.
I don't think that's an issue because Europe is still not a nation, and
Yeah,
European civilization is the main civilization that's called a civilization. And even over the last century, European civilization brought us the most brutal genocidal wars, perhaps, in the history of the world. And
yeah,
right now, there's a new war starting up in Europe. It may be occurring. So let's have a unitary standard on how we look at things. There is
yeah,
the idea of nation, which is a modern concept. The idea of a nation state didn't begin until a few centuries ago. And many of
true,
these nation states have changed
yeah,
boundaries. Germany is not what it was before. In fact, Germany didn't become a nation until the 19th, midnight, what was it, 1872.
yeah,
So in this context, India as a giant, large area, India has 1/6 the population of the world.
yes,
So it's the largest civilizational nation, except perhaps China, but the most democratic. So India has had political empires over time. The idea of a Chakravartin or an emperor who ruled India from sea to sea is found in ancient Vedic text. It's dismissed as mythological, but they still had the idea. And the indigenous Indian opposition to foreign invasion never stopped. Even the Mughals were never able to control all of India. Aurangzeb had the great revolt of the Marathas, and when the British came, the Marathas were the dominant power in India, not the Mughals. And many of these empires or groups, Delhi Sultanate, they were overthrown. They were not
yeah,
allowed to continue. So, in that respect, there has been a political continuity, but there's no nation in the world. Go back in time, the Romans were an empire, They're smaller than India, at least in population and other things. So let's not use that nation standard, because then no civilization is really going to be existing or enduring. But the beauty
Yeah.
is that India has preserved its cultural identity through modern times. And the modern Indian nation state still has a strong traditional influence and honoring of its past, which was
Yeah.
there in all the main independence leaders, whether it was Gandhi, Tagore, Sri Aurobindo. They were looking for a reawakening of Bharat, a reawakening of India, not just simply the creation of a new Indian state. And they looked at, you look at the Constitution, you can see all these factors there.
Yeah. Yeah. So in that case, where do we see, like, where it's originated originally, the Indian civilization? Where do we see it as a starting point, and it's continued until so far?
Well, if we look back in history, we can go very far.
Yeah.
Europe basically had no identity. Romans were not Europeans, they were Mediterranean people. So the idea of India was recognized by other cultures, countries, Greece, Rome, even earlier than that, Mesopotamia. And the continuity, the fact that Vedas and Upanishads are still very powerful, Mahabharata. In fact, the main teachings of Hinduism have stayed the same overall since Mahabharata. So there has been a continuity. And India has been largely a Dharmic or a Hindu civilization, just as you could say that Europe, at least over the last 1,000 years, has been predominantly a Christian civilization. Whether that's necessarily final, you can make your own judgment. But the continuity of India is there, and its identity that is primarily Hindu. But Hindu is also misunderstood, because Hindu is a much broader idea than the Western idea of belief. Sanatana Dharma means something universal or eternal, and it also means uh, embracing the life where embracing your own environment.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for that, Vamdevji. We could keep getting a lot of questions, and at this point in time, we'll jump on to some of our audience questions. I'd like to ask some more questions and discuss with you, but I think let's get on to a few questions from our audience. We got a question from Ashish Nagpurkar, and he says, how have scholars from India not resisted this false narrative and stopped it when we have had so many great scholars? I think he's referring about Aryan invasion theory, or that there is no Indian civilization at all.
Well, India has had great scholars. For example, even someone like Sri Aurobindo years ago,
Mhm.
in the early 20th century, exposed all of that. The problem with it is that a lot of these Indian scholars have been rejected by Western scholarship. If you go to the Western books, for example, translations and studies of the Vedas, there's almost no Indians mentioned. And the
Right.
methods that are used, modern anthropology, etc., aren't part of the traditional Indian methods of understanding their text. This great archaeologist and our friend B.B. Lal just passed away over 100 years old.
Mhm.
And he exposed the Aryan invasion theory on archaeological grounds as well as on geological grounds, was the head of the Archaeological Survey of India, produced numerous papers and studies. These tend to be ignored. So this is what I would call an academic apartheid, where Indian and Hindu views are not allowed. Indian views are allowed if they're Marxist, for example, or perhaps even Christian, but they're not allowed if they have a Hindu view. Even in the United States, if you go to universities teaching Christianity or Islam have Muslims or Christians teaching there. Universities teaching Hinduism, you'll be rare to find a Hindu a practicing Hindu will almost never be found. So that colonial oppression and the
Yeah.
colonial effort to suppress the indigenous narrative is
Mhm.
responsible for that. And to address that briefly, the British, in order to rule India, had to deny India's civilizational past and portray it as backward, superstitious, and poor to justify their rule. Even though before the British came, India had 25% of the global economy. After they left, it had less than 1%.
Just on that one, do you think is the situation changing anyway? Now, Is there a more acceptance about some of the research from India and the scholars' argument in the Western world?
It is changing in certain areas. For example, Ayurveda may be examined in tradition and study of integral medicine and
Mhm.
natural healing. The social sciences are where there's more issues. In fact, Hindus are very prominent in the sciences of medicine and physics and all of that. So the have this view of the far left that's infiltrated also the West, and they tend to project the ideas of the Indian communist about India or of the communist in general who were atheist or the Marxist. You'll
Yeah,
find many Marxist Hindu scholars in America, but again, almost no Hindu scholars. So that view has been left out almost intentionally. And to a great extent, this started in India, where the Marxists
mhm.
were allowed to rewrite the Indian historical textbooks after 1947, under Nehru, particularly, it started.
So there is a long way to go in this area then.
Potentially, but there are breakthroughs. The knowledge is there, the resistance is there, the
Sure.
challenge is there, and India can change. If India doesn't change its view of itself, why should other countries change its view? And it is. A new India is
Sure.
awakening.
We have another question from Ravi Ladwa. In your learning of Indian civilization, what blew you away?
Well, I began with my study of all the meditation and spiritual traditions of the world,
Mhm,
philosophy and psychology. And I was most impressed by the Vedanta. And then I
mhm,
was even more impressed by the living and contemporary Indian gurus, particularly Hindu gurus, Sri Aurobindo, Ramana Maharshi, Paramahansa, Yogananda, Sri Ananda, Mai Ma, so many. And I got to know their lives, their teachings, and in some instances, I got to meet them and contact them personally and discover that this whole exploration of higher consciousness, which is so clearly portrayed in the Indian text, is almost nowhere to be found in the West, even in modern science and modern psychology, although there has been a looking to it for a greater understanding of the universe as a whole. Then I came into contact with the greater Vedic tradition, Ayurveda, and so many other systems, Sanskrit language. And I felt I had discovered not only a culture or a civilization, but a way of self knowledge and cosmic knowledge that is relevant to all and certainly very transformative in my own life.
right, right. And we got another question from Kajal Joshi.
Mhm.
Uh, the question is, what is the difference between a myth or a mythology within a civilization and history that is written by the so-called winners?
Well, what happened is in the West, they developed the idea of mythology largely in the 19th century for understanding pagan gods and goddesses. And this was something that went on for a long time. Even there was a neo pagan movement in Europe in the 17th century. What they
Mhm.
decided was to put the pagan gods like Jupiter in the gardens and leave Jesus in the church. Many church gardens have pagan gods. I've seen that. So the idea of myth is that these were not genuine spiritual representations. These were like cultural forms or kind of psychological forms. And they were then interpreted according to social psychological views rather than spiritual aspiration. So the Hindu deities and even the Buddhist and others were put into that mold of mythology, suggesting that they were just made up stories reflecting certain cultures and practices. And that was used to make them inferior to the monotheistic traditions and more suitable for conversion, and also make them unscientific. Even Western science goes back to the Greeks and the Romans who were pagans, not back to the Christians who suppressed it, who were monotheist.
Yeah, right. Uh, yeah, we got another question. I'm just going to quickly run through a few questions, Vamdevji. We got quite a few of them. Uh, we got another question from Gaurav Thoma, and he's asking, what are the modern threats to our Indian civilization and how should we overcome them?
The modern what of Indian civilization?
Modern threats.
Threats to or
Yeah.
from, or both.
Uh, to our Indian civilization.
Well, first of all, there are threats to civilization all over the world, particularly threats to traditional civilization. The native indigenous civilizations of North, South America, and Africa have largely been wiped out, although they are going something of a slow resurgence today. If you go to Europe today, you'll find it has a culture more like modern America than older Europe. So losing the deeper cultural heritage, for example, civilization is not just science and technology, it's also art, philosophy, religion. And even today, we look back to the older cultures and nations for these factors. So preserving the art, the culture, the festivals, the civilizational identity, the beauty, the languages are very important. And India has, in many of the languages of India, including Tamil, Kannada, they have literatures older than France and Germany and England, and yet they're
Right.
looked upon as part of a country. In fact, there is greater cultural diversity and literary diversity in India, I would say, than in Europe overall. So the threat is in losing the heritage and not preserving the traditions that are helpful for all humanity and confusing science and technological development with better life. It's true,
Right.
science and technology aid us outwardly, but unless we change our consciousness in a greater dharmic way, we may just continue to have more wars and more conflicts. That is what has seemed to be starting again.
Right. Right. So most of the time, I think, if I understand that correct, I think more than any threats from the outside, India itself need to preserve some of its own heritage and the culture to maintain the civilization.
Yes, I would like to comment on that. One of the greatest threats to Indian civilization has been what has happened since independence, particularly the ascendancy of the Marxist, both under the Nehruvian Congress banner, under many socialist banners, and then communist banners, as we have had in Bengal and even continues in Kerala today. And Kerala today, I noticed at the universities, they're putting up pictures of Che Guevara, a Cuban revolutionary of the 1960s, not pictures of Narayan Guru or Adi Shankara, the great people of Kerala. And again, the textbook being rewritten and a lot of the media and academia being under Marxist control, like at JNU, and giving that image out, and then projecting that image of negative India to the Western media, New York Times, BBC, and because their English is good, it's often picked up without criticism, and a growing jealousy of the success of India and Indians overseas. You know, in America, we were told Indians were poor,
Yeah.
superstitious, uneducated, unclean, and we had to save them. That's what I was told as a young man. Now in America and in UK, they're saying Indians have too much money, they're too well educated, they're too powerful, and we have to be careful or they're going to take us over. So the jealousy is also there.
So it's not took too long, not much time, as it from there. It's from one narrative to another narrative. I think this
Yeah.
is what we at Vichaar Manthan like to question some of the narratives going on in our times. I'll take this last question. It is from Radhakrishnan, and he asks, as mentioned, names and forms change over time. Kindly give an idea of Indology versus South Asian studies. Was that
Okay.
renamed with any intentions?
Well, first of all, South Asia is a word nobody heard of a couple of decades ago in historical studies or elsewhere. It's a geographical term. And in that regard, there's no continent called Europe, by the way. It's just a certain portion of Asia. So we don't call European civilization Northwest Asian civilization. We don't call China East Asian civilization. And yet, India's status as a civilization has been well known historically and geographically. So, what that has done has been a way to denigrate, you might say, Indian civilization or remove its role. And in that respect, it's caused a lot of distortions. So if we recognize India as a civilization, it's the civilization is India or Bharatiya. There's no such history of a South Indian civilization, and that must be known.
Yeah. I think we are running out of time, Vamdevji. We got around 5 minutes now. We'll go back. We'll go to your closing remarks. Uh, in brief, in probably around 3 minutes' time, if you could give us your closing remarks on what does the Indian civilization have to offer to the world.
Yes, well, first of all, India is arising. There is a new India coming up, owing to the new government, owing to intellectual and spiritual changes, owing to economic and political development. India has stature as a nation on the global stage. I think Narendra Modi has more friends throughout the world at a government level than any other leader, at least more pictures with them. What India offers is the Dharmic civilization, what its gifts spreading to the world: yoga, meditation, Ayurveda, Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikh, Jain, even a lot of Sufism is coming from India. A science of consciousness, not just an outer material science, a sense of human beings having universal responsibility, a greater movement towards ecology, a more spiritual art, more natural healing, and in a sense, a revival not only of Indian civilization, but of global civilization and of native and spiritual heritages throughout the world. India is the largest democracy, the oldest and largest indigenous native civilization, the only one that still has the words of the ancient rishis from 5,000 years ago. So it can continue to be a great guide to the world. There's the traditional idea of India as Vishwaguru, or the guide of humanity. So I think these are there as a possibility. And if India can awaken that civilizational ethos, then that dharmic approach, then the other dharmic civilizations that have been in Asia, dharmic approach to life, I think can be awakened globally. Hari Om.
Harivom. Thank you very much, Vamdevji, and also would like to thank all our participants who joined in this fireside discussion at Sustainable Narratives 2022, supported by Earth Charitable Foundation. If you would like to find about more about Vichaar Manthan, please visit our website. Or if you want to get involved, feel free to visit our booths and the networking area. After the discussion, we have a networking area. Within that networking area, we have something called religious table, where we will have some of our VM team as well as I would ask Vamdevji if we had some time, please come onto the table. Uh, some of us can ask Vamdevji more questions there and interact with him, and all the participants come onto this networking area and just share some ideas and some narratives which are happening in the world. And it would be good for us to even to take some of thoughts and ideas from you guys so that we can bring that to the discussion. I would like to thank you very much, and thanks everyone for joining today and taking time. And see you probably in our booths or in the networking area. Once again, namaste, Avamdevji. Thank you.
Namaste. Hari Om.